Welcome everyone to the second part of this first series of talks, the first in the series of talks for Esoteric Easter. So this is still the first talk, but the second part of the first talk in a separate video. I didn't want to load you with history at the same time that we were talking about spirituality. But that's actually what this paper 170 does. Is it is couched in the vicissitudes of the time of Jesus, and then it lifts you out of that and says, well, this is what he really meant, and then it drops you back into the history at the end of the paper, where they give a kind of prophetic critique of Christianity and a forecast of the future. All in one. And so it's a lot of complexity in paper 170. That's why we need two videos. So this time my eyes are not going to be darting around. I'm going to just kind of speak from the heart and from memory of this paper, because I've been studying it, believe it or not, since the mid 70s. And so I'm working on it really my whole adult life. And I've come to the conclusion that the incarnation of Jesus was a magnificent, heroic, audacious act by the celestial host of love and mercy for us and for the planet, that they timed so that over centuries, this seed would be planted through much difficulty and suffering, but would come to fruition at a later age. And that is, after all, one aspect of the kingdom teaching, which is that it is a future reality. It's something that's present now inside of us, but it's also a collective reality that comes to culmination at the end of the age. And it is in a way culminating in our time. And so it is correct to say that that Jesus' teaching is also was at the time about a future reality. But it had to go through a lot of convoluted steps in order to come to where we are today. And that's really my bottom line observation, is what a mess this planet was when Jesus incarnated. He had some very tough raw materials that he had to grapple with, which, as we learn in the Urantia Book, Adam and Eve failed in their mission to do, very roughly the same thing, which was bring a mission to fruition on planet Earth. They failed. They had to abort the mission, and so did the original mission of the Caligastia 100. We're not going to get into that right now, but people coming into this discussion should know that this is a planet that suffered from a double default in its early history. So Jesus is coming. They in order to find a way, an entrance for grace and healing, the best they could do is to send the creator of the local universe into a hellacious realm, of the Roman Empire, and to teach a sincere people, the Jewish people, that had a corrupt leadership, a murderous leadership, and in addition to that, he had to work with the teachings of the Old Testament, which were contaminated by teachings that were not intended to be there, that were planted by other forces, you might say, but then which were contradicted by the prophets. And the prophets got concepts across, which came to fruition with Jesus as the ultimate prophet. But much of that, that teaching was lost because the prophets were killed. Yet they recorded their teachings and put them in the scripture to their great credit. So Jesus and Christianity built upon the prophets, and they built upon the law. That was preserved in the Old Testament. But embedded in that is this teaching of the kingdom of believers that we get in the Old Testament, that was a kingdom that would be assembled, put together miraculously, not so much assembled, but by fiat, inaugurated on earth by the Messiah, who was the redeemer of the Israelite nation, but who would vindicate their existence by making their teachings, their God, Yahweh, become the universal deity of the whole planet. This is what they were taught, that they were God's chosen people, and that the Messiah would inaugurate a miraculous kingdom of the whole earth, and that they would be sort of the avant-garde, the teachers of all of humanity. And it is true in a real sense that the Hebrew nation was inaugurated for that purpose. That was the original intention, and the intention remained enough. There was enough of that original seed and light that Jesus could pull from that to get a gospel teaching across in terms of this old notion that had come down for many hundreds of years. And he wasn't going to negate the whole thing. He was going to use some of their language, but then he was going to transform and transmute the language into something much deeper and much more transcendent. And to their credit, many of the Hebrews accepted it, and they became the base communities for the new Christian church. And of course, many Gentiles, in particular Greeks, but many others around the Mediterranean embraced this new hybrid teaching. And this hybrid teaching was an unfortunate amalgamation of ideas that were not in Jesus's actual teaching. They combined what they thought this was about, and in many cases it was human invention. And in particular, we learn in paper 170 that the Christians did not, just like it tells you throughout the Urantia Book, the apostles didn't really get this. They got some of it, but they just couldn't comprehend that the Messiah was a spiritual being from outer space, so to speak, who was coming to teach them a pure, futuristic notion of God's love for the individual that can be experienced through worship and prayer, through communion with this infinite Father and Mother. That was a pretty advanced teaching to a nation to people that barely believed in human psychology and the psyche. They hadn't even really discovered the human psyche. And he's speaking to your consciousness. He's speaking that to the indwelling of God within, which is pretty mysterious. And so no wonder they didn't really understand it, and they marginalized the women that Jesus taught. Mary Magdalene and the women, what is known as the women's core, who, in my opinion, likely understood this better than the men. They eventually got marginalized and then written out of history, barely having a presence in the Bible. Mary Magdalene's present, but we don't learn about her the truth and reality of Mary Magdalene as the leader of the woman's core. And we find that out in the Urantia book, but we learn in the one of the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Mary, that Mary actually was a teacher to Peter. And Peter didn't like that so much, and that's reflected in that Gnostic Gospel found in 1945, the Gospel of Mary. But getting back to the main point, is the apostles made a major error right after the death of Jesus. We're going to be examining this as we go, but just kind of foreshadowing what we're going to be talking about is they were so amazed at the resurrection of Christ that they made the religion into religion about that and about him and about his death, resurrection, and glorification as the leader and redeemer of mankind, of humankind. And in order to put that at the center of their work, they began to create a social institution. First in rudimentary communities, but then comes Paul. Along comes Paul, the Apostle Paul, who never knew Jesus, but who received a spectacular revelation, but who also himself distorted this gospel, the simple gospel, really, of the transcendence and immanence of God in the individual, into a teaching about Christ, who was, of course, a glorified divine being incarnate. He got that right, but he made Christ the head of the church, not your elder brother and my elder brother and father creator in my heart, but the redeemer of the new nation or the new church collective called Christianity. And this opened up Christianity to all kinds of abuse by power-hungry dictators, really, who called themselves the Christian church hierarchy, particularly in the West. And they sort of ran wild with a kind of oppressive social organization. However, it had within it many potentials, which did come forward even in the early centuries when the mystical wing of the church really kind of broke off on its own in the desert of Egypt and created the desert tradition of mysticism, of Christian mysticism, which is not commented on very much in the Urantia book, but it's alluded to. And that group carried on in its mainly monastic tradition, the gospel of Jesus as we get it corrected in paper 170. So that's something to celebrate. So down from those centuries comes a lineage of mysticism, of monasticism, of Jesus's presence in the heart of the believer. But the predominant understanding of Christianity in the Bible is that you become a member of what Ken Wilber calls a mythic membership. You enter into a mythic mythic brotherhood whose head is Christ, and you have to conform to the rules of this social organization in order to be a member and to not get cast out of the membership. So this then developed into the Roman Christianity with its oppressive rules for believers, with a creed that you had to believe, recite, and you were not allowed to offer individual interpretations unless they were approved. But even as that was coming about, there was the Gnostic movement, which was really a protest against this perversion. And in my book in chapter 6, if you care to look that up, I talk about how the Gnostics really understood certain features of the gospel that the Orthodox Christianity subordinated. And but they got wiped out, unfortunately, and tragically, by the emerging church hierarchy, really by the 5th, 6th century in the West. But they survived in certain ways in the monastic tradition, especially in Eastern Christianity. So I'm just really just summarizing some of these issues for you to hopefully inspire you to read paper 170 and to go forward now into the papers up ahead for us. We got a lot of papers to read through or scan through, or at least look at the table of contents and remind yourself if you've read it before. But if you're new, try to dip in to the papers that are coming. But here's sort of the final important, very important message of this paper 170, which is the tragedy, and really they call it the evil of the church, is that they substituted this social organization for a spiritual brotherhood, which we just talked about in the last video, which has to do with these cardinal features: the centrality of the individual, not the centrality of the church, of the community. It's about the individual's personal relationship and the centrality of their decision, their will to enter into this communion with God as mother and father, and then the resulting love that comes through us into the spiritual brotherhood. This is an invisible brotherhood, really. It's not an outward church that you have to wear a suit and tie and shave yourself, put on perfume and a special hat to go to this building. It's actually a brotherhood that has no dogma. It has really not even a creed. It just has this freedom of relating through faith to our Creator, who is both within us and around us. So what happens with Christianity is they create a church which substitutes a religion about Jesus, which they got an important point here. Jesus was a divine being incarnate in a human being. They got that. That's beautiful. That's in the creed. Thank God that they got the cardinal point is that we had the gift of an incarnation of a high being. That's great. That's there. So, but they made it all about that, and it's not just about that. It's about you and me, and about the divine gift within us of the kingdom that is actually the gifting of our personality and of our freedom, our spiritual liberty, and of our consciousness that becomes God consciousness, because God indwells us, and that we can commune with that fragment of the divine within us and feel this presence within us. And so, that pops up here and there in Christian mysticism, and we celebrate that in New Age teachings, and in the 21st century, we know now from other sources that there's something divine in the human heart and mind. But the early Christians in the Christian church put that aside, and it was not the religion of Jesus, but a religion about Jesus. And Paul did create a progressive society. They praise Paul in one passage here, saying he went about creating the most advanced, really progressive society on earth. And okay, that's kind of a big statement. But throughout the Urantia book, they also put Paul in his place. And I'm sure Paul didn't really intend to be such a central figure, so much so that Pauline theology and Pauline spirituality replaces the gospel of Jesus. And if you go to church, they're quoting Paul half the time. They're rarely quoting Jesus. Not rarely, but not as much as we would do now that we can do now that we have recovered the teachings of Jesus and the life of Jesus in the Urantia book. So, the prophetic forecast that the paper 170 gives us in conclusion is that this amended, corrected teaching of the gospel that we get in the Urantia revelation and in other ways coming in our time, this will be presented to the whole world in one way or another. We will, humanity will understand in this much broader context, much more philosophically advanced context and method, will understand what Jesus is all about. And Jesus is all about his love for us and our reciprocal love for him and for one another. And that's, maybe take that away with you for this first discussion for Esoteric Easter. And I thank you so much for tuning in. And next week there'll be a new video coming out. So keep your reading. We'll go through the coming 5 papers to paper 175. If you want to be a good student, read through those dramatic papers as Jesus enters into Jerusalem. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.